We are continuing the story of Abraham this week, and really the story of origins. When we look at our faith and our world and everything going on, it is important to us how we tell our origin stories and where things come from and how they began. I've been reading this book on great inventions and ideas, and it's amazing because the whole purpose of the book is to go, how did this come to be? How did he get or she get this great idea? And it's all about origins, and people want to know, well, where did that come from? How did you learn to be such a great golfer? Or how did you get this idea about a computer that does all this stuff for you? And we like to hear those origin stories on what's going on and what's happening. They're very significant in the way we think about things and the way we live out our life and prepare for tomorrow and what we're going to do next. One of the reasons that the church is struggling, one of many, we'll say, that the church is struggling, is because we're in this like weird battle about our origin story. Is that a way that we can talk about the science-religion conflict? I think it's fair to talk about that as an origin conflict and how we tell our story. So even though we've put on the screen in the beginning, I haven't talked about Genesis 1 through 11 because we're talking about the origins of the faith tradition, starting with Abraham. But I think it's significant that as we talk about origins, one of the things that we're doing is we're saying in the origin story, in the narrative of the world, of the cosmos, we're at battle in this weird way. We don't have to be, let me just make that clear, we don't have to be at battle about our origin story. For starters, who cares what a scientist thinks? Secondly, we have to have a pretty strict reading of our text to even be in that conversation to begin with. So that's not even just strict, wrong, sorry. But we're having these conversations about origins, and it's constantly at the forefront because we are fighting, who gets to tell this story about the cosmos? Who gets to tell the story about what God has done and how God works in our world? And it matters. It matters in how we live out our daily life. It matters in how we think about our faith. It matters in how we respond to tragedy or to joy. It matters what that origin story is. So that's why we've been working through this. And aside from the fact that I just love origin stories, and I've always been fascinated with sort of the origins of my faith and religion as a whole, it's important to people, and it changes how we look at the world. So that's why we're doing this, and what we've done so far is we started with Abraham and say, where did Abraham come from? He responded to God, you remember, here I am, and he just has followed persistently without all of the rules in place, without the traditions of you're going to show up to church on this day at this time every week for this amount of years. He's just listened and responded to God. The second place we went last week, we left off with Jacob and Esau and the role of the trickster and God using people that aren't supposed to be used to tell his story, to continue his story. And we looked at all of these people that God uses that society would have said, well, they don't belong in the important part of God's story. But here it is, a whole Bible filled with stories about people society would have cast off, or at least not emphasized. So this morning we're going to continue that story. Where we left off was Jacob stealing Esau's birthright. If you remember that. He stole the birthright. Not really, he sold it. He sold it for some stew, which makes you wonder about the value of the birthright. But then he tricked his father into giving the blessing with his mother's help. So what happened was his mother said, all right, I'm going to lose my husband and my son if you don't get out of here. So she said, Jacob, you've got to go. Go back to where we came from. Go back to the land where you come. And then she went and talked. This is great. We're still talking about tricksters because they keep going. Then she talked to Dad and said, hey, I think it would be best if Jacob went and found a wife from our people and not from these Canaanite people. And so he was like, oh yeah, that's a good idea. He should go. So Jacob goes, but she was really worried about losing her son to Esau, who might have killed him after everything that happened. So he took off. Here's what I want to do this morning. I want to talk about something that we miss in these stories. One of the things that we look at these quote-unquote fathers of faith, fathers of Christianity, or whatever you want to put there, and we say, man, what great faith. And we've done this, admittedly, we've done this in our series. We've said, here is a person who just listens and follows and obeys. God says go, and Abraham goes. God says sacrifice your son, and Abraham goes. And one of the things that is important to recognize is that's not the whole story. We like to talk about ourselves. We like to talk about churches. We like to show up and tell stories about great feats of strength. We like to tell stories about great moments of inspiration. But the reality is, a lot of our life isn't like that. A lot of our life is filled with the ebb and flow of life, is filled with the struggles and people. Here's this family of God that we base our whole origin story on, and one of them has to flee his brother because he's worried about dying. He's worried about his brother killing him. Not to mention he just tricked his father into giving them this blessing. So family conflict is not new. We can agree on that at least. You're not the only one with family conflict, I guess we should say. If you yourself have had to flee your brother trying to kill you. No? Come on. So we tend to think about these people and we get highlights of their story and these great amazing moments and their willingness and their strength. Even people that aren't supposed to have strength show up with great strength and inspiration and faith. But the reality is that even in their lives, they have a lot of ups and downs. They have a lot of struggles that they have to deal with. And this is what Jacob finds out next. Jacob kind of deserves this, but where Jacob goes next, we're in the mid-30s we're in the mid-20s of Genesis chapters. And I'm just going to tell a few stories and then we're going to move past that. But where Jacob goes next is ultimately kind of what he deserves. So he goes back to his land. He helps, he finds a woman that he wants to marry. It is perfect. Now, I don't really approve of this, but he talks it out with the dad, and the dad says, well, if you work for me for 7 years, you can marry my daughter. I'm not necessarily a fan of how that culture works there, but that's what happens. And so he goes to working for this man Laban for 7 years, so that he can marry his daughter. Anyone else work that hard for a wife? I didn't have to work that hard. I know, yeah. I might have a hard time doing that. But, Jenna, don't tell Jenna. But here's what he is. So for 7 years, he labors and toils and does this work, and God blesses him. God blesses Laban's flocks, and everything that Jacob touches grows and expands. And so Laban gets quite wealthy because Jacob is working for him and taking care of his sheep and his herds. And after that 7 years goes by, Jacob says, okay, Laban, it's time. And he says, oh, yeah, it is. You're right. And that night, they have their ceremony, or we won't get into that. It's not quite a ceremony. And Laban sends his older daughter, Leah, with a veil over her face. And Jacob marries her instead. And he wakes up the next morning quite angry. And it is the next morning. He wakes up the next morning quite angry when he finds out. And so he goes to Laban and he says, hey, about this. And Laban's like, well, that's just not how we do things. I can't marry my younger daughter off before my older daughter. He's like, how about you give me 7 more years and you can marry her too? Again, I don't necessarily approve of the cultural things going on here in terms of marriage. But here's somebody that is chosen by God over the rightful sort of heir of God's story, which is the oldest son, Esau. Here is somebody that is chosen by God. Everything he does is blessed. And here he is in this place that is literally a struggle. For 14 years, he spends just working out his days. Literally 14 years. I've been keeping up with some stories in the U.S. of people that have been wrongly imprisoned. And I think about this in this moment. I think about somebody that sometimes these guys have spent 20 and 30 years in prison wrongfully because of the way the trial was done. And they're now being released with no record. And basically, sorry about that. Sorry that your 20 years is gone. Sorry that your life is changed. You're not 17 anymore. You're 47 and you've been in prison and you have no education and no work history. Sorry about that. Jacob's just been toiling for 14 years and working, and we don't know anything about the story. So that kind of moment when he has great faith and he has great inspiration, those are just glimpses of his life. The huge piece of his life is day in and day out struggling to survive, caring for his sheep, caring for his family, taking care of what needs to be done day in and day out. And not only that, he gets pretty angry at that 7-year mark, right? We talked at the beginning, 7 years seems like a long time to work for marriage, but 14 is even different, right? That's quite a struggle. We don't think about these guys struggling or really wrestling with their faith or wrestling with God or all of that we experience every day. And you're not alone in that. I'm experiencing that every day with you. The struggle to press on and live out faith in a world that is extremely depressing. I'll just discouraging and depressing. That's a real thing. And it's not new, and it's not just you. We're all struggling with that. And Jacob, one of the fathers of our faith, also struggled with that. Struggled with the frustration of life and just toiling things away. Eventually, Jacob works for another 7 years. He marries the woman that he loved, and he continues working for Laban. And it's interesting because from there he works. It's a little bit confusing, but we'll call it a total of 20 years. It sounds like might be appropriate. And eventually he works for 20 years, and he says, I'm kind of due some money at the end of this. How about, we talk about what that looks like? And Laban says, you know what? You're right. Everything you've touched has been amazing. Clearly, God is blessing you, and Jacob recognizes that God blesses him in everything. So Laban, again, is wealthy because of Jacob's commitment to God. And this is when it gets interesting. So we know Laban. We kind of come to expect this. But what happens next is Laban says, why don't you take all the speckled and black sheep? But then Laban separates them and hides, basically, all the speckled and black sheep so that Jacob's allotment or Jacob's earnings are much less. But God blesses that too. God sees the struggle, and this is how it's put. God sees the struggle of Jacob and blesses him in this process. And so all of a sudden, the strong and able sheep and flocks are producing speckled and striped sheep. Laban changes the deal. God blesses it a different way. And so God is working in the background, and Jacob feels frustrated and angry, and he struggles over and over. But God's working in the background to smooth things out, to give him that light at the end of the tunnel, to give him that glimmer of hope. And we don't see that. We see only the inspirational pieces. We see only the good things, and because all of that happens in about 2 chapters. And we move on, and we go, wow, what faith Jacob had. But God's working in the midst of these struggles, in the midst of this difficulty. I just want to read one little bit here. Because we don't talk about struggle that much. And I think it's important. Eventually, Jacob flees Laban. He feels like he actually has to leave in the middle of the night. He takes the things that belong to him, and he takes his wives, his servants, his children, everyone, and goes. He doesn't tell Laban. And in this process, he's going to go back home to meet Esau, and he is terrified. In the process of this struggle, this worldly struggle that he's dealing, that he feels he has to literally flee in the night to save himself, to save his family, he also finds himself in a spiritual battle. Here's how it goes. We're in chapter 32, verse 22. The same night he got up and took his 2 wives, his 2 maids, and his 11 children, and crossed the ford of the Jabbok. He took them and sent them across the stream, and likewise everything that he had. Jacob was left alone. And a man wrestled with him until daybreak. When the man saw that he did not prevail against Jacob, he struck him on his hip socket. And Jacob's hip was put out of joint as he wrestled with him. And he said, "Let me go, for the day is breaking." But Jacob said, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." So he said to him, "What is your name?" And he said, "Jacob." Then the man said, "You shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with humans and have prevailed." And Jacob asked him, "Please tell me your name." But he said, "Why is it that you ask for my name?" And he blessed him. So in the midst of all of this struggle with wives and kids and work, Jacob. In the midst of Jacob's struggle with his wives and kids and work, he says, he finds himself in this moment spiritually in a battle with God. Now, if that's not a story about somebody struggling with their faith and where God has put him, I don't know what that story looks like. But a lot of us can tell this story, this same story about fighting with God about where we are in our faith, fighting with God about who's in our life and how we get out of it and where we go next and what happens if we screw up or miss our next opportunity or miss the voice of God. A lot of us have been in this place feeling like we are fighting with God. And I love that this isn't ignored in the text. And it's there more often than we recognize. I love that the author here, that God is speaking through this saying, it's okay to be in that place. Even the greatest men and women of God have struggled in the same story and have the same story to tell. This is about how we tell our story about God. As we talk about origins, we can talk about the origins of our faith too. For many of us, for me personally, origins of my faith includes a story that looks like this in different words, where I feel like I'm fighting with God for my faith. Physically or worldly or whatever you want to say, I was kind of in the same place as Jacob here. I was working on my degree to teach, not to preach, but to teach. And I was delivering papers at night. That's you show up at 1 a.m. and you work until 4 or 5 a.m. I was serving tables in the evening. Jenna was working 2 jobs so that I could stay in school. And everything felt like Jacob's struggle. Everything we did seemed to fail. Everywhere we turned, it seemed too difficult to keep going. That's part of the origin story of my faith, because it's in that struggle with God, struggle with people, struggle with the world, struggle with life, that my faith story really finds its home, finds its place. Because it's out of that I can look back and see God working in pieces, see God working in the background to bless us, to move us forward, even though it doesn't feel like it. Our origin stories in our faith are just as important as our origin stories in Abraham. And they look very similar. But we don't talk about struggling with God. We talk about people that knew what they were supposed to do and stepped up at the right time and did everything they were supposed to do. But here's a story about somebody struggling with life and with God physically. Jacob was left alone. Okay, let's take the reality of this story out. Let's say we're telling a parable, okay? Listen to this as a parable. Jacob was left alone. Jesus might say, a certain man was left alone. And a man wrestled with him until daybreak. And when the man saw that he did not prevail against this certain man, he struck him on the hip socket. And Jacob's hip was the certain man's hip was put out of joint as he wrestled with him. And he said, "Let me go, for the day is breaking." He said, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." And he said, "What is your name?" "Jacob." And the man said, "You shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with humans, and you have prevailed." That faith story that you tell, that I tell, when someone says, "Why do you go to church?" or "Why are you still doing this?" that includes all of those struggles, is what God's story is really about. It's the struggle with God and with humans and prevailing. And we miss that. I don't know if I feel like I've prevailed, but I certainly got out of that situation where 2 of us were working 2 jobs and going to school and fighting all kinds of other things that continued to come up again and again. And at the end of the day, God says, that struggle is okay. It is part of our story. It is part of reality. It is part of God's story. And it's overlooked all the time. So this morning, I know we're coming from lots of different places. Few of us, I promise you, few of us feel like we're not struggling. And that's okay. It's okay to struggle. It's okay to be down. It's okay to let God speak to you in those moments, even if you feel like you're struggling with God. Eventually, believe it or not, eventually we prevail. And God is working in all of those stories that we can't see right now, but we will see when we look back.